suffer local reverses as well as success. No one can say how long this phase of the war may last. But we have every reason for confidence in the final outcome.
Outspoken Citizen X. We take you now to Ottawa.
Okay, and here we are, guys, for episode 12, segment 2, Outspoken Citizen X, average Canadian type podcast. I've really been putting this off for quite a bit. I had gotten myself very intensely sort of entwined in my podcast creation to the point that it was sort of overtaking the rest of my life. At the end of the day, balance in all things. And so I had to take some time for myself to get some things done in life, but we are back one way or the other. I was working on the podcast along the way as well, so that is why we do have an episode ready to go right now. However, it just wasn't right whenever the schedule allotted. However, I've also given myself a little bit of free space to sort of fall off, because I think that it's important that mental health be a priority. And at the least, I did provide a very in-depth episode for the month. And I've also been sort of rethinking on structuring my podcast again in terms of dispersing it in such a way that it won't be as taxing on my time and intellectual ability. I want to give a nice, good episode every couple months, like a nice big sort of topical that is very intense, like the Philosopher's Stone's education reform episode this month, or like this episode will be. However, I would like to try to get to a more casual format in discussing issues du jour, so to speak, and I'm trying to recruit co-hosts so I can have somebody to sort of discuss with, as oftentimes that's somewhere where some of my best thoughts come out in conversation with others as they are sort of inspiring me with their own unique insights. So something that I am looking at doing, but I wanted to give you guys this little update at the beginning of the episode. Normally I would have just jumped right in, but because it's been a little bit of a delay, I think that the viewers deserved a slight explanation at the least. But with that having been said, we are all set to go. And everything is in. So get ready to go. Here is the new episode of Outspoken Citizen X, episode 12 of Average Canadian Type Podcast, segment 2 of Outspoken Citizen X, which is entitled Syndicapitalism, an Economic Reform Proposal.
The institutions of a pluralist commonwealth, worker cooperatives, community land trusts, and a host of other democratized economic institutions, would enable us to transcend the limits of both traditional capitalism and traditional socialism. Gar Alperovitz in the book What Then Must We Do? Straight talk about the next American Revolution.
It's amazing. I honestly can't say any less than amazing. How my life comes full circle in so many ways, that is. How there's always a connecting theme that makes it all make sense. Sure, some things leave me hurt, embittered, or even depressed, but they also leave me enlightened, enriched, and renewed. When I was maybe 19 or 20, I read a book called The Compass of Zen. And this book was by Zen master Sun San. The book brought the reader through the phases of Buddhist philosophy, starting with Mahayana Buddhism. It went through Vajrayana, and eventually Zen Buddhism. It discussed the Diamond Sutras and all kinds of ideas like hungry ghosts and things like that. Now, this book was nothing less than transformative to me in my earlier adult life. One of the fundamental things I decided after having read the book was that the book had taught me that I had no need to have read the book in the first place. Now, by that I mean Zen Buddhism is markedly different than its two counterparts. Its focus on being completely at peace with everything as it exists, regardless of its aberrations, was remarkable to me at the time. Now, interestingly, I knew that I didn't regret reading the book because I knew more information that I hadn't known before. And because, as Zen would encourage, we are here now, so don't dwell on what's already happened. But at this point, I'm sure you're now thinking, isn't this a podcast on economic reform? How does Zen Buddhism apply exactly? Well, sometimes in life things have a way of coming full circle. You know, something intuitively, and then you investigate, and it seems to show that, no, there's nuance here that needs to be understood first. And when you realize that some of your previous thoughts were mistaken or were incongruent with reality, or that perhaps reality had adapted to things you had not considered yet, those things kind of catch up to you. And regardless, your intuition was insufficiently informed before, despite being correct to some regard. So much the same as how I learned I could have just not read the book in the first place, but yet I was better informed for having gone through the process. So as a person who was staunchly socialist as a young man, I had many intuitive notions which I would scream from the digital message board mountaintops. I'd battle and argue with anyone who was willing, whether their credentials were higher or lower, it didn't matter. As a result, I learned a great many things. These things, combined with life experiences and other realizations I may discuss at another time, created a man who is a great advocate for capitalism, in as much as I admired its mechanical efficiency. I also admired what it stood for as an escape from poverty, and thus a way to emancipate oneself. Now, the private markets were a way for the common man to share in the profits of an endeavor. It wasn't forced. Any losses they took were by their own hand and choosing, rather than a centralized economy where the losses become disproportionately shouldered by the public. It was a proposal to allow the industry to be realized by private market participants, members of the public, and to be capitalized on by the public at large. In principle, this is functional, so long as the correct checks and balances are instituted. Now, this is where the Pareto principle becomes problematic. As proficiency centers around 20% of the population in most things, knowledge of the capital markets does the same. Algorithmic trading made for more stable trading environments, but it also enabled microtransactions that manipulated the markets, and online pump and dump schemes were a real threat to casual investors looking to access the markets. Moreover, mass socio-cultural events can have completely unrecognizable effects on markets. For example, the spread of disdain for capitalism deters millions to be disenchanted with markets as a whole, neglect their finances, become anti-capitalist, and see any participation in the markets as a betrayal of their ideologies. And all of these things are precipitated by iniquities arising from a democratic failure in the markets.
Indeed, liberal democracies only surfaced when it was possible to separate fully the political sphere from the economic spheres, so as to confine the democratic process full in the political sphere, leaving the economic sphere, the corporate world if you want, as a democracy-free zone. Yanis Varoufakis, Greek economist and philosopher, in the Capitalism Will Eat Democracy, Unless We Speak Up TED Talk.
Now, as a corporate shareholder, a person does have the right to vote on corporate issues, and board members, and I'm sure with enough ownership, you could actually nominate members as well. So in a scenario where the group of people who alienate themselves from the market and hinder their own economic performance as a sort of middle finger to state capitalism or state socialism, as they might look at it too, overlap with the people who want progressive ideas like green energy to manifest and a millionfold other ideas, then who's advocating for that in the market? Well, the market game is being played every day, and that doesn't matter because it's capitalism. It's just exchanges. The market is the sort of general system of exchanges that happens throughout a day, and then we've created a place with our invention of capital markets, where we can observe most of that happening and have a better sort of take on what's going on. The market game is being played every day, and so it's not because of capitalism. Like I said, the global market would exist regardless, owing to relationships, community connections, etc. Without a market, the transactions just become less transparent and corruptible. So if the game continues to be played, and the players who are mad there's no change are the same players who don't take a stake in the game or the markets, then how can they say they are advocating for anything? They're literally taking their chips off the board and letting the market participants that they disagree with have the run of the game. And this was the perspective I had come to, that the markets required the most progressive people to become wiser, pool their resources, acquire capital power in the markets as a collective, and in a sense, create a cooperative hedge fund of sorts, where funding could be given to companies seen as being promising to innovate in spaces that were advocated for by this cooperative. Problem was, everyone who had progressive ideas like this were anarchists, anti-capitalists, and all talk was about bootlickers and guillotines and out with the state. I find anarchy to be fundamentally juvenile disposition, personally. Even thinkers like Kropotkin or Bookchin believed in a cooperative federation of sorts.
Kropotkin notes that many anarchist communists within the First International initially avoided using the term anarchist. They were Proudhonists, and preferred to describe themselves as anti-state socialists, or as federalists.
Kropotkin went on to quote the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham.
The philosopher who wants to reform a bad law does not preach insurrection against it. The character of the anarchist is quite different. He denies the existence of the law, he rejects its validity, he incites people to ignore it as a law and to rise up against its implementation. From the book, Anarchical Fallacies, 1796.
To which end?
Kropotkin stresses that the anarchist denies not only existing laws, but all forms of power and authority. He or she rebels against power, authority, under whatever form it may appear. Brian Morris, from the book Kropotkin, The Politics of Community, pages 79 to 80.
Whichever way you want to put it, there will end up being an organizational structure that forms out of any federation, however decentralized it is, in order to regard the darker personalities in society who either don't feel the society is going far enough to decentralize, or those who feel it is going too far. And the disparate ideological narcissisms that are always inevitable, especially when compromise becomes a major feature in a cooperative society, as compromises will inevitably mean that all sides are losing some of their long-held principles. Some of the population will be able to accept that. Others aren't going to be able to so easily, no matter the innovation that occurs of it. Not only that, but even presuming that Kropotkin was right when he said,
under the present economic system, in which the worker is compelled to work long hours for meager wages, under coercive management and often in unhealthy working conditions, and with possible unemployment always threatening, work is a drudgery and often loathed. Brian Morris, from the book Kropotkin, The Politics of Community, page 81.
We would still be in a transitional threshold of generations. Biology isn't so easy to be able to wrench people out of their comfort zones without assuming some growing pains over the course of further generations. Narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychoticism are not, after all, symptoms of capitalism, but of the human psyche in response to trauma. So this is why I feel that revolution is not the right way. Any sort of totalitarian sudden shift is not ideal. It would only serve to create a wider divide between people while also destabilizing the security of their livelihood, food networks, etc. And when people are hungry, they're more aggressive and more prone to irrational decision-making. It becomes a zero-sum game, down to the bottom, which even Bookchin recognized the need for an incremental transition with his municipal libertarianism.
I personally feel that anarchism, or libertarian municipalism if you like, is the most appropriate political tendency to defend and advance the social gains that have been won during the past century, and to move toward a society that is truly free, ecological, and equitable. This cannot be achieved through a violent revolution, however much we might sympathize with the social goals of revolutionaries. Rather, it requires a long-term process of building popular movements and institutions that can transform society from below, from the grassroots. Murray Bookchin, From Libertarian Municipalism, An Overview. Anarchy Archives.
And I might reinforce, I think he was mistaken in his choice of anarchy for the word to use, as I think anarchy reinforces a revolutionary spirit by its very nature. And in the end, it strikes out as a somewhat hypocritical statement. We need to be against the state so we can establish a municipal libertarian federation, reads state that I think works better. So it seems very just short-sighted in the end. You're not aiming for permanent anarchy. You're aiming for a replacement of the current state with an idealized version of state that you think would work better. Be honest about it. Now, I think the urge to dismantle the government as is can be compared to a teenager who's fed up with their overly restrictive parents and completely rejects everything they've ever been taught, falling into a misguided attempt to create a stable environment for themselves, but fallaciously rejecting anything that resembles a wisdom that came from their parents, and inevitably falling into a series of events they can't quite get on top of, exposing a slurry of hypocrisies along the way. It's sort of the youth disregarding the experience of those who have been through it. Now, I've always described myself as a minarcho-syndicalist. And this is sort of an idealistic explanation of my thoughts, which I've come to call syndicapitalism, as we've seen here. Now, I say minarcho, though, because I've always been one to think, at the very least, that a night watchman state is necessary.
The main point about the night watchman state is that it does not have any powers which go beyond those which we commonly accept as being necessary for protecting people against violence, theft, and fraud, enforcing contracts, and so on. Friedrich Hayek, in the book The Constitution of Liberty. The University of Chicago Press, 1960.
I found this acceptable so that the state is playing the very most minimal role in the affairs of the market. I'm also a syndicalist, though, because I feel that the market and the state play an intrinsically related role that can't be separated, but have to be distinguished or told apart. So as capitalism exists, much of the relationship between government and corporation, we rely on journalists to convey. And even then, we don't see the whole. And when we do see anything, do we really see the whole? There's no way of knowing, in all honesty, and the lobbying is so opaque. The situational problems between government and corporation is so opaque. All of the financial dealings are so opaque, you could see through a mudded up off-roading truck windshield better than the layers of propaganda and esoteric legal paperwork. Not only that, but the escaping from corporate responsibility by shifting profits to offshore accounts in places like Luxembourg, Barbados, and Bermuda is a fundamental ethical failure as corporate citizens. And I say citizens, because as a citizen, you are a member of a community. And being a member of a community, it is a mutual thing. We all put back into this community what we take out. Otherwise, you have what's called the tragedy of the commons. And so if you're just extracting wealth, you are quite literally ruining the commons. That's why it's a tragedy. Now, sure, they're maximizing profits for a shareholder, which includes Canadian mutual fund holders and retail investors and more. They're also potentially enabling more innovation within their own walls. However, those lost tax revenues would have gone to benefit each and every Canadian investor in the form of Canadian service programs, education funding, and more. Now, instead, we're seeing an abysmal degradation of our services and surging food costs as private companies gouge the public for shareholders with increasingly unethical behaviors a la Galen Weston. Now, this is where the fundamental disconnect exists. As humans, we have a remarkable capacity to justify ourselves, and I find it hard to be overly critical of even the most selfish billionaire, simply because I'm aware of the capacity for the human brain to become enthralled in its own story and to become overwhelmed by sensations. Any failure of these people is as human a failure as any average person's failure in poverty. Unfortunately, it just happens to be magnified in impact and scope when it comes to consequence. So, I submit a crossover economic model for your consideration that I've spent the better part of 18 years thinking about and discussing with various people, improving, and what have you. I call it syndicapitalism, which is an interesting moniker that has come to be associated with anarcho-syndicalism, in that they believe unions should take over industry and give ownership to the workers. You might say some of what I suggest is similar, but as I mentioned before, I'm a compromising man, and I've incorporated some ideas I'm sure many anarcho-syndicalists would find distinctly over-capitalist for their taste, or perhaps don't go far enough. As mentioned earlier, some will find things go too far, some will find they don't go far enough, etc. Or maybe they'll enjoy the mixture. Who knows? One way or the other, I think syndicapitalism, as I submit it, is sufficiently different from anarcho-syndicalism to merit its inheritance of the moniker in full. Maybe that's a little arrogant, but I'll admit that. At the end of the day, if anybody has any disagreements, feel free to air them. I'm more than happy to have conversations and even elaborate on the ideas here with anybody who wants to discuss. But in any case, this has been the introduction to what I call syndicapitalism, and without further ado, I bring you
Syndicapitalism.
Now, broadly speaking, syndicapitalism takes ideas from syndicalism, corporatism, municipal libertarianism, German basic law, Westminster parliamentarism, federalism, and more. It also takes advantage of certain technological resources available to us now in order to circumvent some of the more troubling problems in our previous attempts to create compromise and avoid very incredible pitfalls suggested by opposing ideological elements in the discourse, which is to say, it's basically trying to avoid the pitfalls that are pointed out by people who criticize various ideas. So I've looked at what people have criticized. I've taken a look and seeing what maybe can be done about those criticisms to improve certain ideas and certain thoughts. And hopefully, as a result of the compromises that I devise, it makes things a little bit more acceptable, or perhaps a common ground for people to start discussing on, a platform of kinds. But in any case, the first section.
Capital innovation.
Blockchain is a technology which has the capacity to level the playing field in many ways. If it were to come widely adopted for our economic processes, the number one thing which could improve economic efficiency is absolute transparency of the markets. Faith in the markets is at a low. The banking crisis just happened again. And while these things are cyclical, they remain lifetime experiences for a great many people who notch it up as a point in their ideological certainty against capitalism and markets. Now, avoiding the pitfalls of current crypto efforts, I am a fan of a particular project called T0. Now, this one abides by security regulations and enables the buying and selling of stocks and securities on a blockchain. Australia is currently engaged in a central bank digital currency pilot program with a group of other central banks, and it's looking quite promising. Fast forward all of these tentative and hesitant steps into the realm of crypto, and we see something like what I'm talking about here. But the question is, will it happen in a way that has a broader benefit, or one which causes a net loss? And when I say net loss, I mean from a utilitarian perspective. One person's titillating experience is hardly a broader victory than choices which can support even grander and more sustained titillating experiences for many more people. A few may enjoy some measure of affluence, power, and ego, but the innovation and sustained human growth as a species is diminished. Now, these themes are absolutely vital to talk about when we're talking about a broad infrastructural migration, as these are the exact moments that can be taken advantage of to the detriment of many. Without a well-developed conversation to this regard, we may not be vigilant of the correct things, before it's too late. So to dismiss blockchain technology is moot, just to say it will be here whether you like it or not, and crypto will find its way into common parlance. Now, I mentioned T0 moments ago and didn't elaborate too much, but it too is worth delving into a little bit here. One of the ways T0 has differentiated itself is by obtaining a license from the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission as an alternative trading system, or ATS, under Regulation ATS. Now, this license allows T0 to operate as a regulated trading platform for security tokens, which are digital representations of traditional securities such as stocks, bonds, and other assets. Now, T0 has also partnered with broker-dealers that are registered with the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, or FINRA, to ensure that all transactions on the platform are conducted in compliance with securities regulations. In addition, T0 has implemented a number of security measures to protect against fraud and ensure the integrity of the platform. Now, by operating in compliance with securities laws and regulations, T0 aims to provide a more secure and trustworthy platform for trading security tokens, which can help to unlock new opportunities for investors and issuers alike, which is what I'm referring to here. So it basically verges on a more legitimized version of a cryptocurrency, as one of the greatest criticisms of crypto is the lack of sort of securities and regulations that traditional investments give people. And so as a result, by creating the environments within the crypto space and blockchain space where there is transparency, there is protections, and we can see what is happening, we enable a new economic environment that is transparent and can prevent a great amount of fraud. Now, while I'm not suggesting that T0 become the de facto market, I am saying that it presents a compelling example of what can be done in order to innovate the markets. Now, a big part of my desire to see this is that transactions are transparent, and all lobbying could be done through this sort of system and be lodged into the ledger. And thus there can be APIs and programs and applications which monitor particular accounts, etc., can be made by the public to do these things. And that would be legal because these are transparent political affairs that are meant to be being seen by the public. However, the technology isn't the only thing which requires a shift here. Now, I have to say ahead of time, I've never been a fan of universal basic income as an idea itself. It terrifies me to think about the drug addiction being provoked with it, as one of my best friends became victimized receiving CERB, or CERB, or however you want to call it, and using it to do drugs and passing away inevitably. His name was Joey, by the way. I think it fitting that his name be celebrated here. He was one of my best friends, and I, to this day, am actually terribly sad for having lost him. Now, moving on, despite my disdain for UBI, I have an equivalent disdain for corporate overreach. A combination of technology companies using our online behaviors to get rich off of our backs while invading our privacy and implementing manipulative, consumerist, and even politically propagandized algorithms, implementing self-checkouts at grocery stores, jacking up food prices, whilst farmers aren't even making any extra, small businesses everywhere going out of business, price of living going up as a result of poor fiscal policies, and the ever-growing chasm that separates people from having the resources to succeed and not, has caused me to reflect a lot on various policy ideas to fix the issues. One such idea I thought of over the years turns out to be similar to one written of in the book, Can Labor Standards Improve Under Globalization? By Kimberly Ann Elliott and Richard Freeman, who say,
while minimum wage laws aim to raise the wage floor, they do not reward good labor practices above that floor. A tax credit for good labor practices complements minimum wage laws by rewarding companies that provide good jobs above the minimum wage floor. Elliott, Freeman, source, Can labor standards improve under globalization? 2001, page 65.
And while I agree with the idea, you'd be hard-pressed to popularize the notion of increasing corporate taxes as a nonpartisan level. Low corporate taxes is sort of relatively agreed upon stance. Which isn't to say that there aren't factions in any particular corner who don't agree. But once you've reached prime ministry, you tend to go along with it. As there's a lot of money that goes into a campaign, you don't want to upset the momentum your party brass have established for you. The relationships between party and corporation, which is part of what this whole podcast is addressing, is creating more transparency in that dimension. Corporations do not want to change in the current scenario. The offshore tax havens allow them to get away with paying a pittance in taxes while also gouging the taxpayer in price inflation, while also paying off their politicians to get what it is that they want out of society. And so this is where I don't have a disdain for government in particular, and I don't have a disdain for the private markets in particular, nor do I have for unions. I have a disdain for the state of affairs as they are, because these three entities should have a better ecosystem that was better created to foster a transparent ecosystem and ecology for them to exist within. Now, pivotally, blockchain technologies could end the offshore tax haven practices if done right, which is a critical loophole to close. However, as a compromise, I'd suggest eliminating minimum wage as a whole, along with an increase in corporate taxes, accompanied by massive tax breaks for having higher than average wages and other good corporate citizenry. Therefore, every employee making the wage they are making should be authentically getting what the job is worth, as the business actually loses money or value for every employee that is paid below a certain wage, as that brings down the company's average pay per employee threshold, thus affecting their annual corporate tax rate. Now, in this way, they aren't paying you the minimum they have to because they'd pay you less if they could. They're paying you what you deserve, or even more possibly, because they will actually be more profitable if they do that. Moreover, we aren't pricing menial work out of the market, which can create a bigger odd job economy for people who are in vulnerable positions in life.
Minimum wage laws, by artificially raising wages above market rates, reduce opportunities for the least skilled workers to find employment. Rather than helping these workers, minimum wage laws prevent them from gaining the experience and skills they need to move up the economic ladder. Policies that promote economic growth and job creation are a better way to help unskilled workers gain meaningful employment and improve their economic prospects. Source: The Heritage Foundation, The Case Against a Minimum Wage, January 24, 2022.
There are other nuances I suggest along with this. For example, employers which own and provide housing to their employees can be eligible for higher tax credits depending on the wage or living space balance. Also, investment into public infrastructure and that sort of thing. Now, I also thought about in terms of if they were providing living spaces or homes, that they could be entirely smart homes capable of self-auditing in order to ensure proper human rights, because I know that some people might profess, well, if the employer is giving them the housing is not going to be well taken care of, or whatever the case may be, or, there's a plethora of different ideas that could come out of that. But in any case, share your thoughts below or in the comments, or if you're listening on Spotify, I'm on YouTube, so you can go to the comments there, or check me out on Twitter, average CDN TY. But here's the catch. I don't think wages should be paid in traditional currency either. So this is kind of a switch. I believe wages should be paid in a form of sort of crypto stock. Now, I say crypto stock because really, as I was talking about T0 earlier, I can see sort of the markets moving towards a blockchain by default sort of situation. So I might end up, in the future, this crypto stock term might just be referring to regular stock, but a crypto stock currency which acts virtually identically to an index fund share. But again, it's more liquid. So something like an ETF, but more index, like industry index. So the crypto share would be exchangeable for currency capture, which is used for mundane transactions like food or clothes, etc. But for the most part, crypto shares can be traded between individuals in much the same way currency is. The main reason for currency capture is for smaller transactions. For example, the electronic AUD or Australian dollar. That's what they're currently doing in their particular situation. Now, I suggest there be a crypto share equivalent to the more liquid vehicle, which is a non-exchangeable share in that index fund, ostensibly staked for longer-term ownership. The notion is that this would turn the public into stakeholders of the economic sphere of influence via fair and earnest hard work. There'd be 11 of these indexes, by the way, 22 if you consider the durational versions beside the more temporary ones. Mind you, they don't have to be temporary. They can be held for as long as you like, but they're capable of being traded, thus your holdings are known to be dissolvable. As it stands, shareholders of corporations hold the responsibility of electing corporate boards of directors to vote on various policies and directives and more. The access to be involved in this highly inaccessible democratic realm of business is very closed doors. One has to be a multi-million-dollar investor to get any sort of sway in the affairs of businesses in today's age. In a sense, you can say the wages would be paid in industry dividends. Speaking of the industry, I mentioned 11 indexes, but did not mention why specifically that number. There are 11 categories of industries. All businesses fall under one of these 11 categories.
Industry aggregates / syndicates.
Now, these indexes are basically aggregate indexes of the entire state of the economy in that industry or sector, which would be, like I said, very much like how present-day ETFs work. Ideally, all organizations under a certain umbrella would be represented in the aggregate. But I also envision the business market changing in response to the new ecosystem. With new transparency and loss of profiteering comes a new legitimized place in government. Personally, I see formalizing the power that corporations have in the affairs of government as being the only way we can reasonably regulate the informal aspects of their relationship which is manifested below the surface. Therefore, I propose an industry aggregate council to be created for each industry. This council would be made up using the same democratic principles used in our majority rights minority rules premise of democracy. All shareholders would have voting rights on the representation of that industry's council. Further, they would also vote on the council's delegates to the newly innovated National Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber of Commerce, I propose, would become the body which houses the new political institution for corporate transparency. As there are 11 industry aggregates, I propose a 12th party in the Chamber of Commerce, which would hold the balance of power in the chamber, ostensibly local businesses. Many local businesses are not big enough to be included in large indexes, and as such would themselves be measured as a pan-industry. Thus, it would not be recognized the differences in what industry they're a part of, as they are assembled into one aggregate small businesses. The Chamber of Commerce, however, is only one half of a broader suggestion, which is to create a third house in our parliamentary system. While I agree that there are already issues with legislation being passed, I also highlight that the Senate has been an attempt to give localized power to rural Canada, etc., and this suggestion achieves that better. While I'd love to be so arrogant as to say the premise of this idea comes from myself, it in fact comes from Germany. Post-war Germany was in a clamor to define their identity after Hitler lost the war, and they were heavily indebted to the world. The ideas I present, while partially my own thinking, were substantiated by German basic law and observing their approach and studying its impact on legislation, as reported by Klaus Kogel.
Thanks to this approach, The Mediation Committee has helped save countless important pieces of legislation from failure since it was established over 65 years ago, thus making a vital contribution to ensure the legislative process works efficiently. Klaus Kogel, the Mediation Committee of the Bundestag and Bundesrat, a special institution of German constitutional law, page 1.
Municipal empowerment.
However, the ideas are markedly different. In Germany, the Mediation Committee is an assembly of members from both the Federal Council and the German Parliament, and they work together to find compromises for difficult legislation, and then provide the compromise back to the Council and Parliament for consideration. Now, in my view, the Chamber of Commerce and the Federation of Municipalities would make up this Mediation Committee. Now, according to Murray Bookchin, something needs to be done to increase local level influence on affairs. Though I don't agree with Bookchin on all things, this thing I do agree with.
Cooperative federalism encourages collaboration between different levels of government and stakeholders to ensure that policies reflect the diverse needs and perspectives of citizens. Source: Cooperative Federalism in Canada, Library of Parliament, 2018. Subnational governments are critical actors in the policy process because they are closer to citizens and can better understand their needs and preferences. Source: Subnational governments in OECD countries, key data, OECD 2018.
Here I would recommend that the Federation of Municipalities figure out how best this looks in terms of representation, because I'm missing a lot of data to be able to make suggestions, and because I think such a progression should be up to those who are most impacted by it to many degrees. Murray Bookchin was not a revolutionary. He did not agree with violent uprising, but rather an incremental grassroots approach to raising the public's bartering power. His proposal was that a sort of municipal libertarianism be the prevailing philosophy with a decentralized network of federated municipalities. To Bookchin, it was fundamental that power centered on the grassroots. For me, I believe that centralization to some degree is inevitable, and so I disagree with the notion that a municipal libertarianism has to be mutually exclusive with existing forms of government. I do agree, though, that the notion of increasing municipal power is a vital step towards a more potent and engaging democracy.
Egalitarian capital distribution system.
As mentioned before, there are 11 industry sectors which are represented in the markets. I recommended a 12th, which would be the small businesses. Small businesses and municipalities would share the 12th aggregate. The index would be a health measure of the regional level. It would not be publicly accessible except to hold, much like bonds. This 12th aggregate also acts as an investment fund for infrastructure and innovation developments. As mentioned before, employers would be given higher than normal tax rates in this system, and the higher wages a company pays its employees, which it pays in shares, not currency, the lower their tax rate is. In this way, the profits of industry are shared by the workforce who produce its results, and those workers also have the capacity to amass larger voting power by proxy of better access to the commodity. This can, of course, be traded for other shares in the other aggregates, thus enabling a diverse ownership structure decided by the willing participants of the markets and their goals. So to simplify that, basically employers are paying you in shares of the index that you work for. And so by proxy of you being paid in those shares, you and your coworkers have the capability to hold more power in that index and in that market than people who work in another market who have that same capability in the market that they work for. And then from there, you can actually use the strength of your market. For example, if you are performing strongly and the industry you work for is outputting a lot, and therefore the value of your shares is higher, you can actually use that extra strength in your value of shares to acquire ownership by trade with others in other industries, so you can acquire some ownership in those industries as well, which there's more to come on that subject, but I just wanted to kind of drop a little bit of idea on what I was sort of explaining. Now, I propose a universal basic dividend as well on top of all this. So that distributes a small amount of shares from each sector to every member of the public. So in that way, the spoils and losses of the nation's industry are shared in an egalitarian way as well, where the industry who has the most output would invariably acquire its workforce more wealth than those of other industries which performed worse. But the growth in that industry would also buoy the value of the universal basic dividend distribution, because everybody would be receiving shares from that index that's performing so well, meaning that their ultimate payout is going to be better than had you not performed so well. So that enables them to also trade and use the strength of their, the shares that they got and sort of create a trading situation, or they can lock them in or whatever the case for long-term holding, however it is that they decide to plan their ownership structure. And then people can it gives people more freedom in terms of being able to be involved in the market. Now, in this way, the market becomes egalitarian, but also remains oriented to greater performance and greater reward. Furthermore, with minimum wage abolished, but poverty wages being an expensive prospect, alongside a universal basic dividend, the market is able to properly reward particularly productive people in society without prejudice. Moreover, all of this occurring on the blockchain allows for complete transparency in share ownership structures, so you don't have any problems of corruption starting to come up.
Corporations as employees of the state.
Now, I've juggled this idea as a thought, and I'm not sure how I feel about it entirely, but I think it's an interesting notion to talk about. Much like how we, sovereign citizens who have self-ownership, can be employed by an employer, so too do I suggest that corporations actually be considered civil servants, so to speak. I mean, it wouldn't make sense to just call them civil servants, since that is a person who works for the government in varying capacities, but something of a civil service, whereby the corporate sovereignty is maintained, but they are operating in the employment of the state. Thus, there are contracts to abide, which, if defied, could get you fired. And if, for example, there are serious corruption charges, or whatever the case, the corporation can have its administrative boards removed and be rebranded, effectively replacing the company with a new operation. Now, this works better in a system of universal basic dividend because ownership of the industry is held by the public at large, which includes even the previous administration, and thus the operational quality of the organization wouldn't hinder the market, no employment loss needs to occur, and the problem can be rooted out for the most part. Now, it's important to highlight the notion that they are employees of the state, and thus the markets are not managed by the state, but by individual sovereign corporations who operate at the behest of a greater independent council and who create industry mandates, which include companies who explore new innovation, current operations, etc., etc. Now, these mandates come from a grassroots lower republic house split between the Chamber of Commerce and Federation of Municipalities as a part of their daily course, combined with their role as mediation committee between the national and regional levels of government. In this way, moving from a small business under the employment of the municipality with sovereign recourse to the Chamber of Commerce to an incorporated entity included in the 11 major indexes would be a process of graduation. So as a small business, you're in the 12th aggregate, you're getting bigger as a small business, and suddenly you're kind of big for the place that you are, and you can be graduated over to whichever one of the 11 indexes that your business finds itself a part of. Now, the 12th aggregate would be somewhat of an incubator for innovation and local level infrastructure projects. As such, when larger corporations invest money into the 12th aggregate, injecting funds by a means like bond purchasing or what have you, which would be the holding of the 12th aggregate, this is a part of that corporation's tax break, which in turn renders their profit margin to be greater, especially if they earmarked donations in the budget already. Not only this, but it provokes greater investment at the local level, greater opportunity for skills and training development and infrastructure development that can propel greater economic activity as a whole, on top of more wealth accumulation by the public at large to keep the blood flow going. The notion of a private entity entering into an employment contract with the government is different, because in the past, we've always talked about either privatization or nationalization. It's always some sort of either or. I've never heard anyone talk about designing an employment standard between the government and corporations which dictate the civic duty of the corporate citizen, their rights to provide goods and services, and what crimes can revoke those rights, etc. Much like a sovereign citizen can lose their rights to freedom if they violate certain crimes. As in the case of SNC-Lavalin, there was a heavy concern for the loss of employment as a result of harming the company in any sort of way or deterring them from accessing contracts. In order to avoid such a scenario from impacting the markets, whether economically or in a labor capacity, it should be within the Chamber of Commerce's capability to audit the company, do a judicial review, and remove bad actors from any operational capacities within the organization, rebrand the corporate entity, and allow it to continue to operate, thus avoiding economic impact and allowing for a proper judicial assessment of the circumstances. Especially when considering the idea that transactions would have occurred on blockchain and therefore are transparent and discoverable. Now, overall, I have a pretty broad imagined outline here, but there are evidently many specifics which would need to be addressed, and not only that, this is just a described possible system in order to open up the realm of ideas that people are playing with. Things seem forever to be polarized, and nobody's thinking outside of the box and trying to think of novel ways to solve serious problems. We all seem to be stuck thinking about things within the paradigm we live in, and this podcast is an aim at changing that. I'm sure I'll touch base on this idea again in future podcasts and do invite commentary. But now I also talked about covering parliamentary scandals every episode of Outspoken Citizen X. And while I had more topical angle on this particular episode planned, I hope to discuss one particular under-talked about scandal, which is the signing or the sell-over of Nexon to CNOOC and the signing of FIPA. Since foreign interference has been the talk of the country over the last week, I thought I'd talk about how we got ourselves started down this road. Now, the very first thing that I began to have concerns about to this regard was back when China took over Nexon Oil. February 25th, 2013, China National Offshore Oil Corporation, CNOOC, a state-owned enterprise, like a crown corporation basically, finalized the deal with the Harper government to purchase Canadian private oil company Nexon Oil. The deal, for a value of $15.1 billion, which, by the way, we are spending about $7 billion right now on giving every Canadian adult about $200 to $300 for their groceries, which will buy 1 to 2 weeks of groceries. So basically, we got rid of Nexon Oil, and China gave us all a month's worth of groceries in 2023 for it. But that was the largest foreign acquisition by a Chinese company at the time. When this happened, I was at my highest disdain for the Harper government. How could a conservative government enable a state-owned enterprise to own any oil interest in Canada, especially when Petro-Canada had been privatized by conservatives as they didn't believe in state-owned enterprise? Now, interestingly, upon doing some research on this, I actually found that in 1985, 1 year before I was born, the Conservatives, under the mandate of Brian Mulroney, introduced legislation for the partial privatization of Petro-Canada, which had been created actually by Pierre Elliott Trudeau in 1975. Now, actually, I kind of agree with what Mulroney was trying to do. Mulroney had advocated for a 40% sale of shares to the public, with the government retaining 60%. Now, personally, in some way, this resembles what we talked about earlier in the podcast, where the government allowed the public to take ownership of shares to gain profit from an industry which was partially privatized. It's, of course, very different as it worked within the premise of existing infrastructure, but the spirit of what I was reaching for is there.
Most of the oil industry in this country is owned by foreigners and owned by private interests, says Lorne Nystrom, Member of Parliament for the Socialist New Democratic Party. We intend to drag this out and we intend to try and mobilize public opinion against it. Fred Langan, The Christian Science Monitor, October 4, 1990, Petro-Canada to be sold to finance oil exploration.
Now, there was concern about national ownership of the energy sector. And further down the road, however, the government of Liberal Prime Minister Jean Chrétien decides to just fully privatize the joint state public-owned enterprise in order to reduce the size and scope of government. Now, the full sale of Petro-Canada finalized in 2009. 4 years later, we get our very own state-owned Chinese enterprise, giving Chinese state officials access to a sophisticated headquarters and place to launch pad from within the Canadian economy and politics. I think there are certainly better things we could be spending our time with, but since it cropped up, we should be addressing it. There are some valid concerns when it comes to foreign money involved with elections, lobbying, and more, and when you see the erosion of Canadian ownership go from being something taken serious by Canadians, culminating in the founding of an entire committee for the Canadianization of the petroleum industry, to our interests in Petro-Canada being sold off entirely by 2009, it's a little startling to say the least, especially when there's sudden Chinese ownership and subsequent suggestion that they are meddling in our politics. Now, this all comes down to FIPA and how we have basically signed the agreement which puts any type of arbitration up to an independent international panel, which is based in Washington, D.C. I believe it's the ISDC. I'm a little off on the acronym as I'm going by memory, but it's ISNDC or something like that. But they are the arbitration panel, and so should a Canadian national need supersede a private need, and we make a decision to overwrite whatever private need, and the Chinese company, which is going to take a step back because of that, decides that they want to challenge that notion, they can go to an international tribunal who can make binding decisions to say that we have no right as under the terms of FIPA to deny them whatever it was that we came across. So this was the source of a lot of people's concern, was that there is a 32 or 36-year agreement starting in 2000 and I want to say 13, somewhere around there, by Stephen Harper, which put us in a situation where we can be held basically against our will to doing things for China. And now one of the concerns that I have is that China technically, and by all means, I want to eliminate any xenophobic sort of inferences about who I am and whatnot. Like, I'm not against Chinese people. I'm not against necessarily even the Chinese government. Like, if I was to talk about it generally, in the end, like, everybody's just trying to do what's best for themselves and self-survival, and we're in a dog-eat-dog world, so I don't even have enough information to fully condemn anybody in this climate. But by the same token, from the vantage point that I'm standing, I'm going to convey, the impressions that I have. And that's just that at the end of the day, they can't be doing that. They have it in their system, and this is part of what makes me worried, is that in their documents for government, I guess their, what do you want to call it? I don't think it's the same word, but their like charter for government or whatever you want to call it, the laws basically of Chinese society have been set up in such a way where Hong Kong is basically, because of Hong Kong that it's like this. They have it where you can be independent. You can be your own subnational government that, by all visible, looks at it, has nothing to do with China. But in the back end, they are still subservient to China. They pay China to be there, and there's to have this sort of the tax rates and all that kinds of stuff. So there's an entire subservience about it in the back ends. So hypothetically, China could economically swallow another country, and that country could become a part of China, and nobody would ever have to announce it. It wouldn't even have to be obvious, because you're allowed to have your own police force. You're allowed to have your own when you're part of China. Like if you end up being swallowed by China. And at the end of the day, you could be treated exactly that way, because it's within their framework of law to be able to do that, to enable that, and they have it set up so, in their judicial system and whatnot, it works that way. And so that's concerning to me, to know that there are international tribunals that give them that recourse and things like that. And then what other sort of backroom deals may have occurred and things like that. We don't know. We don't know what the true and authentic is. We don't know the level by which the political parties of Canada are exposed to foreign influence. I mean, all of this posturing between parties could just very well be a bunch of people who are all being influenced by foreign actors who are just pointing their fingers at each other, all equally guilty. And because at the end of the day, they need to play this facade, it's being displayed before our eyes, and we all get to choose which one we think is the best at being mad at the other. And at the end of the day, they're all still just doing the exact same thing as each other. And that's something I think is concerning. That's something that I think we need to look into. If we need a public inquiry, what we really need is a public inquiry into all Canadian parties and their financing as a whole. That's what we need. Every party. Who's financing you? Which MPs get money from who? What gifts have they received? When have they visited this and that? Every party. And that's actually something that I wanted to include in this particular podcast as well, which I actually left out a little bit, but I might talk about that a little bit more as well down the road. But I have a political party transparency platform that I was suggesting, and I have a lot of details written down about it. I don't have them in front of me right now, but it was 100% an interesting idea that would be based in blockchain technology as well, and somewhat social media based, but politically entwined with the corporate, Chamber of Commerce and Federation of Municipalities and the political parties all together as sort of a transparency platform as a whole. So that is something that I think would also be fundamental to go along with everything that I've been talking about. But until such time, as I said, I wanted to kind of actually open this conversation up to broader conversation, because the way that I see it is I've got a lot of thoughts. A lot of them are new and novel and different and not something that everybody comes across every day. And sort of like a bridge builder, I feel like I'm kind of like putting bricks over a chasm, and now I'm kind of standing at the precipice here looking out, and it's like I could build more supports, but this is all fresh. Like I'm no longer standing on the ground by which I came from, the communal ground that we all stand on. I'm standing on a fabricated sort of structure that I've built myself, and I'm not so arrogant as to think that I can build this bridge alone. And so I want to press for public opinion to come and say stuff about what I have said, so we can have a public dialogue about the ways in which we can switch corporate transparency to being an integral part of our political process. Because right now it's just sort of subtextual, like it's all, you listen to my podcast, you know where we're at, so I don't really need to explain too much more. But, this is where we're at right now. We need to do something, guys. This is not an okay scenario. We we need to get ourselves to better ground, because we don't even know where we're going anymore. But in any case, some people know where we're going. The rich know where we're going. The poor, we don't know what the hell's going on. And then with AI coming in, things are going to start getting really crazy. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people, were convinced that a picture of the Pope wearing a very, very big white winter coat that looked like he was just straight pimping. Sorry for the use of the word pimping, but I mean, like, it looked like he was like, just got that swag going. And that is not something that you associate with the Pope. Swag, the Pope. It was fake. I saw it right away, and I was like, that's an AI-generated image, 100%. There's no way that the Pope ever wore something like that. Point final. That was my first impression. And I saw the other day that, there was an article, it's like, thousands of people were convinced that this was real. And I was like, there were people who believed that? If there were people who believed that, we are in trouble for what's coming, because that's just ChatGPT 3, GPT 4. We got GPT 5 coming. Guys, this is going to get insane. You need to be, it's going to be crazy. You aren't even going to know who you're talking to anymore online. Which is why Elon Musk is talking about making Twitter pay. But that's even scary, because he's trying to make Twitter pay, like the blue verified check pay, and then you can only be in the For You recommendations if you have the blue verified check, because he wants to make Twitter bots an expensive operation. But when I think about that, even if Twitter bots are an expensive operation, all that does is just turn Twitter bots into something that only rich people can do, which means the manipulation of opinions can only be done by people who have money. And that is a scary notion. So, we have a lot of problems on our plate, society. Let's get together and fix one of the little ones, which is, or little big ones, little big planet going on here. We gotta fix one of the little big problems we got, and put corporations where they belong in society. Figure out, hey, if they are people, because corporations are people, right? So if corporations are people, well then let's set up employment contracts and standards and things like that for them, and make sure that there are laws and things that are in place that can protect us as a society from corrupted corporations who can't be disciplined in the ways that we would like. As I'm sorry, but a few million of a penalty for doing some gigantically bad thing that impacts lots of moving parts when it comes to making bids on different projects, and then those bids being deferred and things like that because of the fact that there's this corruption scandal and the length of time it takes to get a project to board, and then bureaucratic messes, and there's just so much damage that comes out of this for no reason. We don't need to have it. We need some transparency, and as long as everything was transparent, we could actually move forward as a society towards real innovation and not have to have all this mess. Anyways, that's the episode. This is Tyrone speaking. We are out for the day. Take care. Mwah.